Ahead of the release of the October inflation data by the National Bureau of Statistics, analysts have agreed that a moderation appears to be the only way forward. This was contained in the multiple macroeconomic updates from investment houses on the inflation numbers. The September 2025 inflation figure printed at 18.02%, marking the sixth month of consecutive decline. From Abuja, we have Faiz Muhammad, development finance expert. He joins me now. Good morning, Faiz.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yes, a pleasure. And well, we had the inflation target for the year, that's 2025, at 15%. Do you see with the next numbers perhaps we getting to that or meeting that expectation, or we still have to wait for November or December figures?
Well, several other predictions have put the inflation rate somewhere around 16.80%. I do not currently see a reason why inflation would curve below that number. I think by mid-2025, headline inflation was about 22%, in June 20%, in August 18, in September 18. So that's 6 months of steady decline. So I expect it to be lower sometime this month.
And what do you believe would drive that lower inflation projection for October?
Well, I think broadly there are a lot of drivers in place. Relatively stable FX compared to 2024. There's a pause and then a slight easing in monetary policy. There's improved food supply from the harvest season. So unless we see a major new shock, large currency slippage, fresh fuel scarcity, or maybe severe security disruption in food belts, it's reasonable to expect another small decline. It's important to remember, though, that as inflation falls into the high teens, it becomes harder to squeeze out each extra percentage point.
Right, and I'm trying to look up whether or not inflation numbers are officially out. It appears not, right? And this is the 17th of November. We're a week out from the MPC meeting where critical decisions will be made. Why haven't we gotten the latest figures do you have any ideas why we haven't gotten those figures just yet? And what would be the reasons?
Well, when inflation figures are late, the first instinct is to think politics, but most of the time it's actually much more easily explained. It could simply be that since the CPI rebasing happens in early 2025, the NBS is working with a bigger basket, and that makes the data process more complex. I think we've seen this before. In February, the CBN even postponed an MPC meeting because the NBS hadn't released the rebased CBI series.
So it's more a rebasing issue and adjusting to the new basket that they have to break down. Let's look at some of the factors that may be driving or that may drive inflation or may have driven even across the last 6 months where we've seen consecutive declines. Energy costs, what does this have to do and how is this pushing and directing inflation numbers when it comes to petrol, diesel, electricity tariffs? How does this play or how has this played in shaping inflation dynamics over the last 6 months and, in October, considering your projections?
So energy is still the backbone of Nigeria's inflation story. And by October 2025, we're no longer seeing new massive energy price hikes, but we're living with the consequences. Producers are pricing in high diesel costs for generators, higher logistic costs to move goods, and higher tariffs on the grid. Academic work on the period up to 2024 confirms that fuel subsidy removal alone created strong pass-through into both exchange rate and inflation. So in October, energy plays two roles, really. First, it's no longer the pedal that's being pushed further down, but it's still the hill we're climbing. Secondly, stable but high energy costs set a floor under how low inflation can actually go in the short term. So they don't stop disinflation, but they definitely slow it.
And I mean, let's come to a key driver of inflation. For a long time now, food inflation has been quite high and has driven inflation numbers or has kept inflation numbers elevated. But we're getting reports that, some of the basic commodities, household food items like Gary, the likes, are coming down. And farmers seem to be attributing it entirely to oversupply and low demand. Do you have any concerns around this, or is this a welcome development?
So during the 2022-2023 season, there were global spikes in oil, in wheat and fertilizer prices, and shipping disruptions that fed directly into inflation because of a heavy reliance on imports. In 2025, that picture is very different. Commodity prices have generally cooled compared to post-COVID peaks, and that means that supply chains are less chaotic. Um, I think food and fertilizer prices, even if milder than back then, still influence local costs given our import dependence. So I do think that there is a little bit of oversupply, but external factors are really no longer pushing inflation up aggressively. They just set the background noise. If there's a new global shock, our high import dependence means we will feel it a little more quickly.
And that issue of low demand, do you have any concerns around that?
Well, I think low demand really has to do simply with the fact that there's a little bit of stability happening right now when it comes to the fiscal markets, and that means that there's a period of readjustment before prices stabilize once again. And that's going to lead to a take up when it comes to the supply issue.
And you're not tying that in any way to perhaps purchasing power of the people?
Well, certainly, if there's a currency volatility or a certain level of, inflation, then it goes without saying that purchasing power has been significantly dampened over the past couple of months. For ordinary Nigerians, the question really isn't, is inflation falling? It's, are prices lower? And the answer is no. Right? Prices are still much higher than they were 2 years ago. They're just rising more slowly.
Interesting. We know that there have been a number of interventions and reforms to bring prices down. A lot of the inflation, a good percentage of the inflation was also FX driven. And we've seen a lot of work within the FX market by the CBN. How do you see that particular reform and other reforms driving inflation at the moment and ahead?
There are policy interventions that the CBN has worked with, specifically with monetary consistency. I think there's been no sudden change or large cuts with experimental FX windows, and that's given a little bit more transparency. That prioritizes price stability and keeps the naira relatively steady and anchors expectations. Secondly, their fiscal and logistics support has targeted their support has targeted fiscal and logistics support rather than blanket subsidies. That accelerates strategic food releases. It supports fuel and security along key food transport corridors, and it clears port and border bottlenecks that delay imports of critical inputs. All of these have really been policies that have helped stabilize things.
Indeed. And let's look at the disparity, especially with inflation in urban centers and then the rural areas. How is that playing out?
Well, I think urban Nigeria is still more inflation exposed than the rural areas, though the gap is narrowed somewhat. Under the rebase CBI, the January data showed urban inflation at about 26% versus 22% in rural areas. I think more recent analyses trend towards urban inflation being moderate to the high teens, but typically remains like 0 or 1.5 percentage points above rural inflation, mostly because urban households are more exposed to formal housing costs, higher electricity tariffs, imported goods and services, all of which respond quickly to FX and regulatory changes. So even though both urban and rural Nigerians have been hit hard, the inflation experience is different. In cities, it's energy, rent, and services. In rural areas, it's more about food prices and transport cost to market. Whenever the October release finally aligns, it's almost certain to show that pattern continuing, just at lower levels than in late 2024.
Interesting. We'll see how all this pans out. Of course, there is the control and intervention that we can work out from within the country, right? And I guess they're doing their best in that regard. But how are we taking on some of the external shocks and the pressures from global commodity, markets? Is that still feeding into, prices in Nigeria? Or are we somewhat insulated? What's happening?
No, I don't think so. We're certainly not insulated. Global interest rates shape capital flows into Nigeria's bond market, which influences the exchange rate and imported price pressures. But just like I said earlier, the 2025 picture for inflation is a little bit different, but external conditions matter very, very much. Oil prices in particular drive FX earnings and reserves, which in a turn affect the stability of the naira and imported inflation. So Nigeria's high import dependence means everything that happens externally, we're going to feel it very quickly.
Indeed. And let's come to a group that was heavily impacted, or maybe still is, and I'll leave that for you to tell us, by inflation. That's the SMEs and manufacturers. We saw higher interest rates, borrowing costs go up, operation costs go up. How do you think these SMEs and manufacturers are faring, even with the consecutive decline of inflation? Are they feeling the impact just yet, or you think there's still going to be that lag effect?
Honestly, they're hanging on their fingertips. SMEs and manufacturers face a triple squeeze: higher energy costs, expensive imports, and still elevated borrowing rates. It doesn't mean costs are low, it just means that they're rising more slowly. Imported mechanical parts and raw materials are priced off an exchange rate, and that is far weaker than in 2022. At the same time, interest rates in the high 20s mean working capital loans remain out of reach for many smaller firms. What we're seeing on the ground is shrinking product sizes, and a lot of layoffs to manage wage bills, and then delays in maintenance and retooling, which hurts productivity over time.